Welcome to Season 2 of Initial Margin for Uncleared Derivatives in 2019 and 2020. I'm here with our client and my friend Henrik Beneke of LBBW. Henrik and I have worked together for many years, and Henrik, welcome. When we talked about this perhaps a year or two ago, you thought that maybe LBBW could fall into Phase 4. Were you to have done so, you would have been doing your calculation of aggregate average notional amounts across the observation period of April, May, and now June, and you would have already been furiously preparing to comply with Phase 4. But you're not falling into Phase 4, you're now falling into Phase 5. There's always a temptation for me as a private practice lawyer to think it's all about the documents, but actually, of course, there's a huge infrastructure behind this, and you, being an in-house counsel, will be seeing that. How difficult has it been getting the broader team together? Because things such as who's going to take responsibility for the SIM model, how are you going to have the risk and the collateral parts of the business, talking with legal, put those processes in place.
When we start our internal EM project, we thought we started like the VM project, just with the lawyers, the master agreement documentation team, the regulatory team, and the collateral management. So just a small group. But when we looked into the EM regulation, the margin RTS, and all the ISDA documentation, we realized that there are many departments in our bank are involved into the EM discussion. So we need the people who are doing the custodian documentation, who are familiar with the custodian documentation and do the onboarding process for the custodian documentation. To implement the SIM model, we have to go for the front office people to look how they implement the SIM model in their pricing models, how they bring all the sensitives to the SIM model. Then, as a margin RTS mentioned, you can foreseen in the risk management procedures some exemptions from EM, so you have to talk to the risk management department to make this relevant decisions.
Well, I know you have a love of the law, and I think that's going to be tested as you have to get on top of Belgian law security agreements, Luxembourg law security agreements, the CSDs that you may have to face, the CTAs, all of these different things. So when you pile up the amount of documents you have to read, I think there's a big legal challenge as well for the in-house counsel leading these projects to be familiar of everything that the bank's signing up to.
Absolutely, yes. We have first there is all the regulatory stuff we have to understand the margin RTS and all announcements from the relevant regulators, and not only in the EU. We also have to focus on the international ones, as LBW has branches in Seoul, Singapore, New York. So we also have to look if we are falling with our branch in the relevant scope of the regulatory regime in these countries. And of course, in the legal documentation, we have the English law ISDAs, we have the New York law ISDAs, we do the relevant EM documentation for this, we have the German DRW and the relevant documentation. We have done a lot of work in evaluating on the annual notional average. And we not only reviewed the accounting during the observation period instead of doing this over the whole year to get a feeling for our portfolio. And if we had to look into our data, we realized that we are very near to the Phase 4. And then we looked what we can do to be not over the threshold for Phase 4. So we are now happy to be in Phase 5, but there's still a lot of work to do for us.
Well, it's interesting. I think you're not alone in that. And some counterparties I'd spoken to, they thought, well, if we can push ourselves into phase 5, that's great. It will be easier to get the relationships documented this year and then have an effective date a year down the line. However, certainly the people I spoke to said, well, we thought that was a good idea, but nobody else did. They said, well, wait till next year. We don't really have time to be focusing on someone a year ahead. Was that your experience as well? Did you consider putting everything in place this year with an effective date a year later?
This was one of our plans, but at the end we realized there's so much work to do in respect of the EM implementation that at the end we have no documentation in place so far, and we still have to do a lot of work until 1st of September 2020 when phase 5 is starting, and we are trying to start our negotiation as far as possible or as soon as possible, but we haven't no documentation in place so far.
And of course, in order to start those negotiations, you first have to choose a custodian, get yourself onboarded. Was that a difficult thing to do, or was it fairly easy on the basis of existing relationships?
This was a really easy thing because we had already an existing relationship to a custodian and the custodian which we have chosen, and so this was not too much work, but I can imagine from the time we had first the onboarding process for a custodian that for market participants who are already not onboarded with a custodian or which chosen a custodian where they haven't a relationship in place so far, that this is really a hard work to do.
And of course, LBBW is a single bank. There are not affiliates everywhere. Some other phase 5 counterparties, particularly those before, have found they've needed to appoint different custodians in different jurisdictions. So for you, I imagine it was just a one custodian choice. You're not having to do any multiple arrangements.
Yeah, that's right. We only have one custodian located in the EU, but at the end we also have to deal with all the other custodians because LBBW has a lot of clients or counterparties around the world, and so we have also to focus for all other custodian documentation because our counterparties will bring to us several or different custodians, and so we have to focus on them as well. We have selected for Clearstream and we'll go on with Clearstream Luxembourg.
So what that will mean is you now know, because you've selected Clearstream, that you're going to have to enter in as collateral provider. You're going to have to enter into CTAs, collateral transfer agreements. It's going to be the Luxembourg form, and then you're going to have a Luxembourg law security agreement sitting under that. But which means although you mentioned you'll probably get going with the documentation negotiation later in the year, you would not have been able to start that process unless you had appointed your custodian. And of course the problem of getting going is your counterparties have to have chosen their custodian as well. Not such an issue, I imagine, when you're reaching out. A lot of the counterparties you'll be dealing with will be phase 1, 2, 3 and 4 counterparties, but probably more of an issue when you're dealing with the bank's own clients and other phase 5 entities as well, as a sort of roadblock to actually starting the process going.
Yeah, and the important thing is that you only, as a counterparty, has not only to choose the relevant custodian, it's also important for us that we get the information which custodian it is. So there is a mass of information needed between the counterparties, and if you're having a lot of counterparties, you have to collect all this information from your counterparties to get the information which custodian they have chosen when they are in the scope of IM.
And I think you're going to be one of the more active phase 5 counterparties because you have a big derivatives business. You're going to have a lot of master agreements in place and probably multiple master agreements in place with some phase 1, 2 and 3 and 4 counterparties as well. So there's a big, although you've got the simpler factor that you're just one custodian, you're going to have a lot of ISDA master agreements that you're going to have to put these relationships in place with.
Yeah, absolutely yes, and this is a burdensome of work which is coming up to us to update all these ISDA master agreements and as well the German derivatives agreements as well, and to put in place all the relevant EM documentation with all the several custodians and several counterparties.
I'm at our offices in Frankfurt today for our 5th annual OTC Derivatives Conference. So here's what the regulators have been talking about. This is an extract from the EU RTS for Uncleared Margin, and this is Article 29. And you can see here there's a derogation, and it says that parties can provide in their risk management procedures that initial margin is collected by an amount up to 50 million where neither counterparty belongs to any group. So let's say you have one German Landesbank, it doesn't have any other entities in the group, it's facing another Phase 5 German Landesbank. So this provision applies. Or where the counterparties are part of different groups. So let's say you've got a banking conglomerate, they've got 10 institutions within the conglomerate, all falling within Phase 5. They're facing a Phase 5 insurance company, and that insurance company has subsidiaries in Ireland, Germany, and France. So those entities are falling in, they've got this exemption, also applies if it's counterparties within the same group, although here the threshold's reduced to 10 million. So that means because you don't have to collect any initial margin, if the initial margin you were obliged to collect was less than 50 million euros, that means you don't have to put in place all of this infrastructure. So you don't need to put a collateral transfer agreement in place, you don't need the custodial documentation, you don't need the account control agreements. However, if only it was so easy. And the problem for the market is, well, how do you monitor those thresholds? Well, whether or not you need to collect those margin. That would mean you need to make a choice. Do you use the grid or do you use ISDA SIM? Which regimes are applicable? Various other things. In fact, the very things you need to put into the credit support deed or the collateral transfer agreement. So if you've hit that threshold, and you don't have your infrastructure in place, well, that means you can no longer trade. And of course, it takes time to put that in place. It could take several months to put custody documentation in place as well. So the relief's not quite as good as it seems to be. And the question for the market is, at what point do you need to put the infrastructure in place? Do you need to put it in place immediately so you can monitor this? And is that going to be relevant for counterparty pairings which are never going to hit this 50 million, perhaps because they're only dealing in FX swaps? Do entities need to put in a sub-threshold here, say 20 or 30 million? At that point, you put these arrangements in place. Again, it's complicated because this 50 million threshold does not apply for each counterparty matching between groups, although that's something that's quite obscure to understand when you look at Article 28 of the EU RTS, but is set out in more detail here when you look at the actual rules for BCBS IOSCO for non-centrally cleared derivatives margin requirements. But as this threshold of 50 million will need to be divided across two counterparty groups, so in my example there, where you had the banking conglomerate and the insurance group with multiple matches between those counterparty groups, that 50 million threshold is going to need to be allocated across the different pairings. How's that going to be monitored? So again, there's going to be a monitoring element that goes on, is involved. There has to be a decision at what point credit support deeds and collateral transfer agreements are put into place, and further clarification is needed from the regulators as to just how that works. So the BCBS IOSCO press release back in March was a starting point, but further guidance is needed from BCBS IOSCO. Again, further guidance after that from the regulators, hopefully on a coordinated basis as well.
Solution provided by BCBS IOSCO sounds quite nice in a first view, so that you don't have to bring your documentation in place if you are below the 50 million threshold. However, there are more thoughts to be done on this, because as you already mentioned, you have to think which are the relevant levels where you to kick in the negotiations with your counterparty. And from a legal point, I always try to figure out, do I need to make an agreement with the counterparty that we agree on levels on which we start negotiating, or is it just an internal rule where I say I will start when we have a 30 million threshold over, and then we start negotiating? Or must I look with the counterparty? Can I stop trading? What is the relevant level for it? Is it the 50 million, or could be also when I stop trading the already EM calculation go over the 50 million, so that I must be put in something like a buffer to have a little bit place for market movement.
Well, you can't just flip a switch and say, great, okay, we've got the 50 million, let's sign the docs, because you'll have to onboard the custodian. You'll have to get through all that KYC. You're probably looking 2-3 months. Process to get this in.
And you still have to negotiate it with your counterparty.
Yeah.
So maybe your counterparty is not just waiting for LBBW, that LBBW is coming around and saying, so we now just wanted to negotiate the EM documentation. Maybe there are some other counterparties which are in focus of the LBBW's counterparty, and then we have to wait for it. So this is maybe a good solution, but there are still a lot of questions which must be resolved to get this as a solution for the market participants.
And I imagine you're going to have to look at this on a granular level. If there's a counterparty and you're only doing swaps, which actually you don't have to margin because they'll be one of the exempt FX categories, you'll probably think, well, actually, we're not going to bother here, or we're going to, or we'll just keep a watchful eye. But if you have a counterparty where you're hedging real estate loans, you're doing some more exotic trades, you might need a bigger buffer. Are you going to look at it at that sort of granular level as well? There'll be some flexibility, perhaps, or is this all thinking required to be done once we get some more clarification from the regulator?
These are thoughts we have already done, but not finalized our thinking about it, because we are still waiting for more guidance from the regulators or from the market or the market associations like ISTA to get a solution. But you're absolutely right. If we get more comfort or more guidance from the relevant market participants, we have to do this thoughts on it and to figure out for which counterparties this exemption is useful and helpful, and for which we are sure that we will be over the threshold in a timely manner, and then we will putting the whole documentation in place, of course.
And with that, I'd like to say thank you to Henrik Beneke of LBBW for giving us the in-house perspective of a Phase 5 counterparty. If you've made it this far, I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.